I like to think of like those finger traps where, if you've got your fingers in a
Yeah.
trap, that finger trap, and then you try to pull them away from each other, they get stuck. But if you let your fingers relax and like move towards each other, then the trap relaxes and then you're able to have more freedom there. And
It's
I
a
like to
great
think of
analogy
our,
indeed.
yeah, I like to think of our system in the same way, where if we're trying to, get away, get away, get away, we're just going to be stuck in that suffering of stuckness rather than, yeah, let me turn towards it and ground myself in ventral or an IFS, access some self energy
Yeah.
to then be able to have some curiosity or openness towards what it does, the tension in the chest need to tell me,
Yeah.
because there are answers there.
Going Inside is a podcast on a mission to help people heal from trauma and reconnect with their authentic self. Join me, trauma therapist John Clark, for guest interviews, real-life therapy sessions, and soothing guided meditations. Whether you're navigating your own trauma, helping others heal from trauma, or simply yearning for a deeper understanding of yourself, Going Inside is your companion on the path to healing and self-discovery. Download free guided meditations and apply to work with me one-on-one at johnclarktherapy.com. Thanks for being here. Let's dive in. Excited to introduce my guest for today. Natalie Deering is a level 2 IFS trained therapist. She's also a podcaster, and I'm excited to see where this conversation takes us today, Natalie. Maybe fill us in a little bit more as to who you are and how you got here.
Yeah. Thanks, John, for having me. I'm excited to spend some time connecting with you. Well, yeah, a little bit about me is that I am a licensed therapist and I've been practicing now for, I don't know, maybe 13 years, maybe 13 or 14. And I live in northern Kentucky, right by Cincinnati, Ohio. And I am level 2 trained in IFS. And I have my husband, Bill. I have my son who's 4. His name is Quill. and yeah, we've lived in Kentucky. I've lived in Kentucky my entire life, but I also love to travel. I have siblings that live in California and New Hampshire, so we're kind of spanning across the United States. And yeah, I love hiking. I love being out in nature. I love connecting with other people in the wellness community. And so when I got connected with you, because you and I did a collaborative event with a collection of, how many was it? 5 of us,
Yeah, I think 5. Yeah.
yeah, 5 podcasters, who focus on IFS. And that's how I was able to first connect with you. And I was really grateful for that because I had seen you around on like my Instagram and things like that. And it's funny because like I was meaning to reach out to you to connect. And then when we had that invitation to do this collaboration, I was kind of like, oh, perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Now I can talk to John.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it worked out. It really is
yeah.
the IFS community really is a community and a small world in that regard. And then the collection of podcasters who focus on IFS is even smaller. So yeah, it's a group of people that have a ton of passion for the model and talking about it. I think a podcast is a great format for that. So um
Mhm.
yeah, and I'm from Virginia originally, so Kentucky feels close enough to me, even though it's not like,
Yeah.
20 minutes from home. But yeah, just being home, or you know, it reminds me of being home. Um,
Mhm.
so I'd love to hear. We talked before the show about talking more about anxiety, talking a bit about IFS, but also polyvagal theory. Sorry, polyvagal is not something we've talked a lot about on this show, so could be interesting to start there and
Yeah.
just see where it takes us.
Yeah, sure. So I was actually introduced to polyvagal theory before I knew anything about IFS. I didn't come to know about IFS until probably or 9 years into my career as a therapist. And I actually heard about it through my yoga instructor, who I was taking yoga teacher training at the time with. And she mentioned it. And it kind of was like one of those things where I was like, oh, that's interesting. And I kind of like planted a seed, but then left. And then it was maybe a year or so later that a client said it again, like said it to me again in session about IFS, and then it stuck from there. But until then, I was very immersed in the world of polyvagal theory. So, like learning about the nervous system, learning about fascia and the body, and somatics and embodiment and meditation. And so, polyvagal for me, I love to incorporate it now with IFS. So I want to say that I now weave those two together.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, polyvagal theory is something that was created by Dr. Stephen Porges and then later expanded upon by Deb Dana, who is another clinician. And she's just written so many books going into polyvagal theory and making it very understandable, in my opinion, for both clinicians to understand, but also people who aren't providers, but for people who just want to learn about the nervous system. So, big shout out to Deb Dana. I was able to interview her on my podcast, and that's been one of my favorite episodes just because of just the knowledge that
Yeah.
she has about the nervous system is really cool. But yeah, so polyvagal theory in a nutshell is basically this understanding that we have, and I'm sure most of your listeners are familiar with at least some of these terms, but we have, our vagus nerve, and we have these various branches from our nervous system. We've got the parasympathetic, which is the rest and digest. We've got the sympathetic, which is the fight and flight. And then we have the dorsal, which is the shutdown. And so Dr. Stephen Porges, like he was able to look at that and come up with this theory, which I kind of feel weird still calling it a theory because I feel like it's
A therapy.
true, right?
Yeah. That's probably why I said therapy earlier. I've been hearing it referred to as theory for so long, which, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so it's just, yeah, it's this biological understanding about our nervous system, how we have this ventral vagal state, which is that parasympathetic space where we feel, connected, grounded, calm, safe, and how when something happens in the external or even in the internal that our system deems as a threat, then we shift into that sympathetic fight or flight state where we either need to fight the threat or run away from it. And if those things don't work, if those things aren't even an option, maybe let's say, then our system shifts into that dorsal shutdown, which helps us basically numb and dissociate and basically kind of like prepare ourselves almost for death or extreme pain. And we can feel this at various points throughout our day to varying degrees. It doesn't always
Yeah.
have to be extreme levels of shutdown or fight or flight. It can be these subtle experiences as well. So that's polyvagal in a nutshell.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. It's a great starting point. Can you tell me what a polyvagal session looks like?
So the way I can tell you how I used to do it,
Yeah.
and that was I would do a lot of like psychoeducation with my clients about the nervous system. So I created like a lot of sheets. There's a part of me that loves making sheets.
Fun. Yeah. I dig it.
I love like putting information down in like a clear, concise way.
Yeah.
I love when there can be like graphs or
Yeah.
pictures of some kind. So I'm looking over here because where I'm sitting, I can see like all of these folders where over the years I've collected and made these information sheets. And so, yeah, I would start off with like a discussion about like what is the nervous system and what are maybe different areas of the brain that's also activated and connected with the nervous system in terms of this survival, the survival mechanism that we have built in to our bodies, which is really amazing. And I find that when we're able to have education about this stuff, I feel like that helps bring some clarity, some understanding, as opposed to maybe being blended with parts that have fear or confusion
Yeah.
about the different states that we can be shifting in.
Yeah.
So that's where I do feel like having an opportunity to understand what is going on within us and what is the nervous system doing.
Yeah.
I feel like that is really helpful and that it was soothing for me and my system, probably in my early 20s when I first came across this.
Well, it makes sense because you're building safety and resourcing by helping people understand exactly what's happening physiologically in the experience of anxiety, panic, dissociation, right? Flashbacks, whatever it is, urges to drink, whatever it is. Um, Something I know, and part of my journey is years ago I worked under like a CBT purist, and so we would do interoceptive exposure in the treatment of panic attacks, which is
Mm,
basically exposing people to their own sensations. So the idea is that when someone first has a panic attack, it's usually this oh crap moment of, oh my gosh, something really bad is happening to me, right? And I'm going to pass out or die or whatever. Um, and they don't have a label for it, right? But it's like
mhm.
someone pulled the fire alarm and there's no fire. And
Yeah.
part of the cycle is they don't have a label for it. They just know it was horrible, or maybe they eventually labeled a panic attack, but then they get into this cycle of avoidance, right? And on one hand, you could say, well, they're avoiding heights or planes or social situations, but really they're avoiding the internal sensation of panic, the internal sensation
Mm,
of their nervous system overreacting, right?
yeah.
Or false alarming, right? And so we would gradually expose them to those exact sensations in a safe and gradual way that helps them build this relationship with them that, oh, that's just my body false alarming again, or my body trying to keep me safe, even though I'm just here at a work meeting or, having a
Yeah.
difficult conversation with my partner or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I'm curious to ask you, like, how do you feel like typically people, I guess, responded to that?
Yeah. Well, usually very well, to be honest. And it's still something I use today. If
Yeah.
in the case of like pretty cut and dry panic attacks, like someone is like, I had a panic attack on a plane and now I'm afraid of going on planes. I
Mhm.
often do some interoceptive exposure work with them. Um, you could just as easily do some parts work with them along the way or in conjunction or blending the two, as you mentioned before with polyvagal. But um, it's very effective, and by the research, it's extremely effective, right? It's like people in the kind of evidence-based quote unquote camps, like my CBT supervisor, and everything that he does is, you know, evidence-based quote
Yeah.
unquote. So it works, and you have to be careful, and you have to go slow, and you can kind of, it can be reactivating to experience your panic again. So
Yeah.
on the other hand, I'm about to go through the somatic experiencing training, like the certification process, and I love that model because it's such a gentle
Mhm.
renegotiation with the nervous system of trauma. That process that started during the trauma or the thing, um, that process we can help that process to complete or help the nervous system in this renegotiation of safety and unsafety. So I'm really
Yeah.
excited to learn that model like in its pure form.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because what you're describing with like inviting a client to experience maybe the symptoms connected to the panic, let's say. So in that like that sympathetic state, that is similar to like polyvagal theory, a polyvagal informed session where, you would invite the person to have this like ventral grounding, let's say, like image. I always say we want to help the person feel like they have at least their feet in ventral. So let's have a foot, 1 foot, 2 feet in ventral, meaning like a feeling of groundedness and safety, to then be able to have that curiosity,
Yeah.
to then be able to go into the world of the sympathetic as well,
Right.
of that fight or flight. And being able to be with that, being able to be with that world of sympathetic while still feeling grounded in
That's right.
ventral. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what, it was reminding me of that.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, it's this idea of, yeah, titrating, the work, or the idea of pendulation, right? The nervous
Right.
system swinging in and out of states of safety and unsafety is something I talk a lot about with clients. Even just having clients track their state as they're talking about something, I
Mhm.
generally find for a lot of folks in general, um, we are not quite aware of what's happening inside as we talk about something, right? And so I might have a client that just sits down and starts talking about plans for the weekend that they have, and something is activating about it, right? And so I'll just invite them, hey, can you slow down and notice what's happening inside as you think about the plans for the weekend? Well, it's just I know my mom is coming and I really want it to go well, and there was a time where it didn't go well, and I just yeah, I am a little short of breath, and I'm just,
Mhm.
yeah, I remember that time it didn't go well. Okay, so just slow way down, right? And like, can we
Yeah.
work with that? So I'm tuning into those cues even more than like, oh, what's the content about? I want to hear about this story about mom, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that reminds me of, the personal profile mapping in polyvagal, where you encourage the person to bring awareness to the different states.
yeah,
So, what does it feel like for them when they're in ventral? What does it feel like when they're in sympathetic? And what does it feel like when they're in dorsal? And it's inviting them to look at and to bring explicit awareness to what are the body sensations in each state, what are the feelings, what are the beliefs, that what are the thoughts that might be happening there. Because yeah, we want to befriend, we want to bring this understanding to what, when I am in these different states, let's say, like you said, if I'm talking about this thing that's coming up, can I bring awareness to my system shifting
yeah, yeah,
into those different states? Because when
right,
we have awareness of it, like explicit awareness, then that's the opportunity to actually like do something with it, as
yeah,
opposed to just being
yeah,
stuck in it or
yeah,
spiraling in it. So,
yeah.
absolutely.
I find that just helping clients to safely and slowly go toward the sensations paradoxically helps the sensations to lessen, right? A
Mhm.
lot of clients come to therapy because they want to get rid of a feeling, right? Like get
Right.
rid of anxiety, get rid of grief or whatever. And so as my client's talking about the weekend, if she notices in her body this tension in her chest, or focusing on the part of her that's worried about this weekend, where do you find that part? Well, I find it right here in my chest. Can you just go toward it with your hands and just be with it and see what that's like for the two of you?
Mhm.
And maybe then the part starts talking.
Right.
Maybe I'll say, like, if your hands were ears, can you just listen for a second and see what you get,
Exactly.
right? And
I
maybe
like
she
to
might
think
hear something. Yeah.
Yeah, I like to think of like those finger traps where, if you've got your fingers in a
Yeah.
trap, that finger trap, and then you try to pull them away from each other, they get stuck. But if you let your fingers relax and like move towards each other, then the trap relaxes and then you're able to, you know, have more freedom there. And
It's
I
a
like to
great
think of
analogy,
our
indeed.
yeah, I like to think of our system in the same way, where if we're trying to get away, get away, get away, we're just going to be stuck in that suffering of stuckness rather than, yeah, let me turn towards it and ground myself in ventral or an IFS, access some self energy
Yeah.
to then be able to have some curiosity or openness towards what it does tension, the tension in the chest need to tell me,
Yeah.
because there are answers there. And it's funny, you bring up that one specifically because that's my body's go-to is like chest tension and tightness. And actually a couple weeks ago, I had been feeling really, just grounded and not a lot of anxiety activation in that physical way. But then I started feeling that chest tightness and I was like, "Oh, I could immediately tell a part of me being like, "Oh no, not this again. This is annoying or we don't like this. We're scared of this." And I was able to be like, "Okay, I understand. All right, just can you just soften with that for a bit and let me just turn towards this because I want to know what's going on here. Like it's activating for some sort of reason." And so I was able to like sit down on my meditation cushion and like turn inside, ground myself, access some self energy. I was doing some breathing and some movement first, and I was able to turn towards that chest tension. And it was interesting because what came forward was something, it was activation connected to an Instagram post that I had posted earlier that day, and parts of me were fearful of other people that were
Yeah.
involved or connected with that post being mad at me
Yeah.
or disappointed at me, which goes down the line
Yeah.
of feeling abandoned and rejected and all of that kind of more wounded energy stuff. And it was like once I was able to have some clarity with that, I was then able to breathe like, oh gosh, okay, I get
Yeah.
that now. Like that makes sense. And then able to then ask those parts who had those fears of like, okay, so what do you need right now from me in order to feel safer with this? Like, do you want me to contact these people or do you, and so then I didn't have to do any of that stuff. Like eventually that part that was creating that chest activation was able to soften. I think just based on me having that turning towards
Yeah.
with that curiosity and that openness to hear it and to not judge its fears or anything like that. But yeah, it's so fascinating. That's where I love somatics, like somatic experiencing, because it's like if we can just pause and turn towards these sensations, there's a message there.
Yep.
There's a message.
It's beautiful. A lot of clients come in with this sense of like, why can't I just calm down? Or um, perhaps for a lot of us, where we learn that is being upset as a child and being told, just just calm down, right? Or stop
Mm,
worrying or don't be ridiculous. Or in your case with the Instagram post, I'm sure no one's mad at you. I don't
yeah.
know that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well-intending parts that want to reassure, but then
Mhm.
end up minimizing, right? And it doesn't feel good.
Right.
Doesn't feel good at all. And that's such a different energy than this going toward and being with part,
Mhm.
right? What would it be like just to be with that part in your chest that's worried about the Instagram post and how it landed with certain people?
Yeah.
Sometimes
And that
that's more than enough, right?
exactly.
That being
Yeah.
with and that witnessing.
Yeah, because I didn't have to, I didn't need to take down the post. It was
Yeah,
it was that part was fine. It felt softer and calmer, like you're saying, like with me just turning towards it
yeah,
and hearing what it had to share. So yeah, it's having that awareness that we were saying, that explicit awareness of what are the different shifts that I feel
yeah,
at various points. And Deb Dana talks about, she's like, the goal here is not to be in ventral all the
Right.
time. She's like,
Right.
that's not possible, number one, but it's also not helpful for our survival. It's being able to be flexible and to be able to shift in and through,
That's right.
these various states while knowing we have a foot in ventral
Yeah.
and not getting stuck in the sympathetic, not getting stuck in the dorsal. That our nervous system, our system just knows its way back
That's right.
to ventral.
That's beautiful. The Instagram thing is interesting because I think it's emblematic of the larger um, societal moment we're in of living a very digital life. And in the case of this Instagram thing, there's this sense of like, I don't know how people are reacting or perceiving me, and there's something naturally very activating about that. Same thing of, like, getting an email that was just short and 2 sentences, and parts of me going, "Oh my gosh, I'm in trouble," right?
Yeah.
I have parts that are like, "Oh my gosh, I'm in trouble, and they're gonna leave me, then I'm gonna have no one, and I'm gonna have no clients, and then no money, and I'll be homeless starting
Right.
tomorrow," right?
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so part of it is, like, when parts of us can't further check that out and get that information, some of our parts fill in the information, right? And from a nervous system perspective, our nervous systems are ready and primed, or maybe have been historically primed to get ready for something, right? Someone
Mhm.
leaving me or being annoyed or thinking I'm too much, right? And so this our core wounding is just it's always just right there, I find, right? And
Yeah.
and, and especially when we're not sure, we're not looking at the other person and going, um, do I get a sense right now when I'm looking at Natalie that Natalie's mad at me? Right. I don't
Mhm.
have any of those cues right now. Like she's listening, she's nodding, she's
Right.
very kind. It's like, that's good. I'm good with that. Right. But in another interaction where maybe I'm missing some information, right? I have parts that
Mhm.
they fill in the rest of they fill in the blanks.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I think that's so true, right? I mean, we are living in this technology, digital age with texting and social media, and we aren't seeing people's faces. We aren't hearing their tone of voice. And so, absolutely, we can have, yeah, these parts that, like you're saying, fill in the blanks with these stories. And those stories are going to be directly impacted and influenced by our past, by the wounds that we have and the burdened beliefs that we have about
Yeah.
ourselves and the world. And yeah, I mean, there's many layers to it. And that's why, like, there isn't a way to just say, like, oh, well, this is gonna, when you're anxious, it's gonna feel like this to you. Well, it's gonna feel differently to everybody. And I mean, there's so many different types of anxious symptoms
Yeah.
that someone can have. And there's different levels of the energy that those symptoms can have within someone. And there's no way to say to someone else, like, this is, oh, I'm sure that's overwhelming for you. Well, that might not be for that person, but it
Yeah.
might be for you. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
going
true.
to be it's very just independently based on each of our bodies and
Yeah.
our histories and
Yeah.
our family line, and how much one believes in potentially even like ancestral lineage impacts, and even maybe like past life, potential impacts. Like,
Yeah.
there's a lot. There's
Well,
a lot.
there's a lot of emphasis on, again, controlling anxiety, and a lot of even techniques in therapy that focus on helping people calm down, which,
Mhm.
on the surface sounds good. Someone comes into your office really anxious, and the therapist tries to help them calm down. Um, I helped teach IFS at Stepping Stones. Derek Scott was my first
Yeah.
teacher, and uh, one thing that I find with a lot of the practice sessions we do, where a therapist gets to try IFS with a client, or another practitioner who gets to be the client, is sometimes the client will have a lot of activation right from the beginning of the session. I'm nervous about this, or something just happened right before starting class, or whatever, and the therapist will do we'll basically close that trailhead unintentionally by going, okay, all right, so you're anxious, you're anxious, or something happened for class. Let's just breathe. Can you just breathe?
Mhm.
Like really just slow down and breathe and breathe and breathe. Um, and I might have done something similar at some point before IFS, before seeing that as a trailhead, right?
Mhm.
Of that's the inroad to, can you go toward the part of you that is scared or upset or devastated, or you just got in a
Mhm.
fight with your partner and they threatened to leave or whatever it is. It's like, I don't want to shut any of that down. To me, that's where the work is. So we go toward that. Um, but how do you, how do you see it, or even blending these
Yeah,
polyvagal and IFS?
I'm glad you bring this up because this is something that was, awakening for me, came to my awareness as I started doing my own personal parts work and realizing that there was, like, a manager part within me that before I had learned about IFS, I was very yeah, there was this manager within me that when a client would come in, they'd be anxious and I'd be like, this part would come in with like, oh, here are all of these tools, here are these techniques. Let's go through
That's
these
right.
so that I can help calm this activation right now.
Yeah.
And again, came from such a positive intention of wanting to help that individual
Yeah.
feel that foot and ventral again. But like you're saying, it was then closing that trailhead to, well, why were they anxious? And what is that connected to in the first place? So as I started to learn about IFS and now where I'm at now is, so let's say a client comes in my office and they're super activated with anxiety. Typically around like my first-ish question might be something like, okay, like does it feel okay to be with that right now? Like does it
Yeah.
feel okay to be with
It's
this
a
level
great
of
question.
activation?
Yeah.
Because if I'm going to try to invite the person to turn towards the activation, but their system is so overwhelmed by it, then that's not going to work. And it
Yeah.
may even then lead to more activation.
Yeah.
So I'll ask that question of like, does it feel okay to be with what is here right now? And if the answer is no, then that's where I might then slow it down and invite them to engage in some sort of grounding technique of like, okay, well, maybe let's just take a minute to do some breaths.
Yeah.
And but then I'll also use language of parts now too. So I'll be like, okay, so maybe invite the parts connected to the activation to breathe with you.
Yeah.
So I'll
Send the breath
invite
to the
yeah,
part.
so, like, I'll lead them through a breathing, but I'll be asking the parts within them to breathe with the breath of the
Yeah.
client, and, like, maybe invite, like, some more spaciousness, with the client with that energy, and to invite the parts to just notice how that feels, that this is not pushing them away, but this is an invitation for them to actually connect with the client with more clarity, because if they're overwhelming the client's system, then they're not going to be able to connect with it.
Yeah.
So I find that is,
Yeah.
yeah, usually very helpful. And typically the person will let me know of like, okay, yes, like I'm feeling there's a softening
Right.
there. Okay, I feel comfortable. I feel safe enough to turn
Right.
towards it now. And it's like, okay,
Right.
great. Now we can turn towards the parts connected to that activation without it leading to other parts swooping in with shutdown or um, panic or
Yeah.
whatever it might be. But yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up
Yeah.
because getting to know that part of me that was very managerial in that way of like, oh, here's all these techniques and here's all these sheets that I've created with
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
all of these tools and everything. It's like the tools aren't bad
Yeah.
when used in a way that is, accessing some self energy to then turn towards the part. It's a game changer. It's just if the
That's
intention
right.
is
Yeah.
to use those tools to avoid completely, then it's
That's
not
right.
it's not going to help.
That's a great way of differentiating, right? When using those tools to just help people avoid completely, right? To basically never go toward the wound or heal the wound, um, or help the part, that's when it can become almost like an avoidance strategy, right?
Mhm.
Same thing for my client who has panic attacks, and whenever they feel them coming on, they take their Xanax or their Ativan, or they have 2 glasses of wine, whatever. It goes down, and they're like, "Whew, okay, I survived that one," right?
Yeah.
Which is a really common way to kind of get by, or just to kind of evade these panic attacks, right? And evade
Yeah.
what's happening inside. So yeah, I mean, basically what you're saying, and if they is offering them a little unblending, right? By coming
Mhm.
in and connecting with the breath, bringing bringing along clients, or parts, can breathe with me, or like sending the breath to the client. These are
Mhm.
all really neat ideas. And then the work might be more accessible, right? You can actually do the work, because we have to have some
Exactly.
percentage of self to do the work. Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. So now that's how I look at it now. Instead of giving someone tools and techniques to avoid, now I'm offering these tools and techniques to help them access self energy to then be able to
Yeah.
turn towards the parts.
It's awesome. I am. I'm curious to get your thoughts on this experience I had. I have seen many, many therapists in my life, and I consider it an essential part of our training. I take it very, very seriously. And I've seen many types of therapists as part of my personal journey and part of my training, right? I generally don't ask clients to do anything that I haven't gone through myself.
Mhm.
I find that to be very important. And um, I worked with a therapist who, at least to her description, used polyvagal theory therapy. Um,
Mhm.
this was my first time living in San Francisco. I had been through some capital T trauma stuff, and I would go to her house, which is where her office was. Granted, she was also very old school, toward like retirement age. But part of how she would work with me was on a table. She was a therapist, like an LMFT, but she would work with me on a table. You already look confused, so I'm
Yeah.
like, was this crazy?
I'm like, interesting. Okay, tell me more. Yeah.
So here's what she did: is I wouldn't always be on the table, but just sometimes I would talk on the couch. Also, the sessions were unlimited time. If it took 35 minutes to get somewhere, then that would be the end of the session. If it took 2.5 hours, that'd be the end of the session. I would walk out, and some poor next client would just be sitting there, very, very unique.
Yeah.
She was eccentric, but I also think very fondly of her. But when I would access more of the trauma or the memories or the activation, she would usually invite me onto the table, and she would basically have her hands like under a sheet underneath me and be working with different parts of my body, but really just like holding her hands there. And she
Yeah.
would talk about diaphragms, which maybe you can expand more on. Um, I remember it working and being extremely powerful, and she was
Mm.
helping me and my nervous system, again, negotiating these states. And I remember it being very intense. I wasn't necessarily like making great cognitive realizations, which didn't feel like the point, which was interesting because at the time I was literally a CBT therapist.
Yeah.
So here I am on a table, like just crying or releasing or being pretty
Mhm.
nonverbal, and she's not saying much. So to this day, I'm like, what do you think that was?
I think that's and you felt safe with that, it sounds
Yeah.
like, correct. Okay, good.
Yeah. It
I
was
didn't That's
very
great. Yeah.
therapeutic. Yeah.
I I love I love when, like, things can weave in multiple modalities, and it
Yeah.
sounds like she was weaving in, obviously, like, touch and energy work,
Energy work.
perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and
I think so.
I personally love that. I mean, me as a professional, I'm not, I don't do that per se, but I'm all for receiving that myself, So
Yeah.
what you're describing, I'm like, "Oh, that sounds so nice. I would totally be down for that."
Yeah.
And and I love I'm a big believer in, basically, if something works for you, great. Like, I'm not here to
Same.
tell you
Yeah.
that something's not
Agnostic.
gonna, yeah, like,
Yeah,
I'm
I
not
love
gonna
that.
be like, "That's not real." Like,
Yeah.
I'm never gonna say that to someone
Yeah.
because it if it feels great and it feels
Yeah,
helpful, beautiful. I love it.
that's right.
So, as you were describing that, the vision that I got was when I was in yoga teacher training, I was really drawn towards restorative yoga more so than the, vinyasa, like
Yeah,
really kind of more hot and sweaty movement, type
right.
yoga. When it was restorative yoga training weekend, I was like, yes, this is my thing. And in that training experience, what I felt really drawn towards was, we would invite participants to get into a restorative pose. And for the listeners who don't know, a restorative yoga is basically where, you get into a supported position, usually using a lot of props, yoga blocks, blankets, bolsters, straps, even. And you're in that position for an extended period of time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It just depends. And what I would invite when I was leading, when it was my turn to lead in the training, I would invite the participants to get into a restorative pose. And then, with their permission, I would go to each person and I would just have this sense of, I would usually like stand or squat like next to them or behind them, even at their feet. And I would invite like a gentle touch on various points of their body, depending on what I was noticing. So maybe it was like resting my hands like on their temples
Yeah,
or on the back of their head or on their forehead, on their chest, on their feet, on their hands, sometimes on their belly. And the feedback that I received when I invited that was, when you put your hand there, and again it was consensual and it was safe,
yeah,
they reported feeling a shift
yeah,
in their nervous system. And Deb Dana talks about that too in Polyvagal Theory, where she talks about co-regulation as a
right.
big piece to nervous system flexibility and healing, and that co-regulation being more so with human to human, but she also talks about how it can be like human to nature and human to animals
Yeah,
and things like that. But when it can be with another human, that's where it can be really healing to our nervous system. And with that co-regulation, like you were saying before, it's like eye contact,
yeah,
facial expressions, body language, and also connection through
yeah,
touch, our own touch, but also safe touch from another person,
yeah,
and how important that is. That's why one of our biggest punishments in our country in like the prison system is isolation because it's like
yeah,
that's
right,
torturous.
right.
That's torturous to our
Yeah, your DNA literally starts to unravel.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, it's
yeah,
it's just not what
yeah,
we it's not what we need. We need that safe connection. So it makes sense to me that because you felt safe with this provider, with her,
yeah,
and she was able to connect with you
yeah,
with touch and energy, that it sounds like that
yeah.
felt like it was doing something for your nervous system.
It was, and she also was explaining to me what she was doing, which is another great way to create safety. As a therapist, I intentionally don't have a lot of cards up my sleeve or whatever, tricks up my sleeve. And the therapists I teach at my group practice, I encourage them to do the same. That's a great way to build trust, especially with clients that have a trauma history.
Mhm.
Um, this piece around touch, I think we're already running out of time, and I think we're probably just scratching the surface with what we have in common. But part of my journey has been, well, actually, just last weekend, I completed my Reiki level 2 training, practitioner training, and
Yeah.
although right now all my work with clients is virtual, um, I have a lot of ideas and wonderings and excitement around how these things could be integrated. Or for at one point, my client who was having the panic attacks and was actually the one who will take the Xanax and the wine as a way to just kill it. Um, one day after my first Reiki training, we were sitting there across from one another, and the panic was starting to set in. And I had him see if he could just kind of go toward it, right? And be with that sensation. But then if he were to just see it as energy or like excess energy in his chest, I said, what if you could just move it down like an inch? And he was like, "What? Yeah, I can do that." He like did it. I was like, "What if you could then move it up an inch?"
Yeah.
He's like, "Oh yeah, I can do that." Like, what if you move it down an inch? It's like, yeah, that kind of, I guess I kind of can do that.
Mm.
A couple things, right? Gave him a new sense of agency and curiosity, and the panic was less demonized as like this thing I have to
Yeah.
be constantly running from.
Mm.
And if it's all just energy, which again, this is like a can of worms potentially, um, then we can kind of work with it a bit, right? I
Mhm.
also think there's parallels between self energy and Reiki or Chi or prana, all these.
Oh, yeah.
So we could do an episode on that.
Yeah,
Maybe
we
we will.
right. I was gonna say, I was like, I got to interview my friend, Christine Keisinger, who's a Reiki master, and
uh,
she's also trained in IFS, and so we did an episode on how Reiki and connection to self energy, and I love Reiki. I just started seeing my own Reiki person, and it's again, it's just kinda it just makes sense to me.
yeah, me too.
It makes sense that, yeah, we
Yeah,
have all these we are made of energy and matter and particle and
yeah,
waves and all of this stuff, and, I mean, I feel like there's so much that we don't yet understand
yeah,
that we have capable within us. So, I think
yeah,
that's really cool, your invitation with your client to invite them to turn towards that maybe that panic within and to invite them to notice, yeah, can you shift that energy down? Can you shift that
yeah,
up? Like, and it sounds like the person was like, yeah, I
uh-huh,
can. And how cool is that?
yeah,
How cool is that? So I think
yeah.
it's amazing.
My therapist in San Francisco, integrating like touch with therapy, again, part of it worked and very much was like a consensual thing within the therapy or in her informed consent. And, she was a 70-year-old woman and I'm a, like there was kind of less strings attached, I think, to it in terms of her using touch.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I think bringing it back to like how we got here, which is if trauma is not a cognitive process, then the healing probably isn't much of a cognitive process, right? You don't think
Mhm.
your way into trauma. You're probably not going to think your way out of it. And so the more I do this work, and even the more I do IFS, I do it very somatically,
Mm.
right? And just see that the body, we have a long way to go with integrating the body into psychotherapy, especially because uh, the world of psychotherapy was rooted in psychoanalysis
Right.
and having these extremely heady, approaches to thinking about why you're so messed up, right?
Mhm.
You've got these unconscious, um, uh, you know, sexual and violent urges, and we got to work through those. And the therapist sits there collecting data on you to come in with some grand interpretation that hopefully blows your mind and heals
Right.
you somehow. Like that, I think about that a lot because it's like that wasn't that long ago
Oh, I know.
that was like the start of what you and I do as therapists, like
Yeah.
today, right? Or even like now I'm on the table with my client, or now I'm like bringing Reiki
Uh-huh.
into my work or just experimenting with it. It's like we've both come a long way and we have a long way to go.
Yes. Oh, yeah. And I think it's so interesting, when I meet other clinicians and who are trained in therapy and they don't know about IFS and then they know that I'm IFS and they're like, "Oh, what is that?" And I tell them what it is and I give them a little bit more about it and it's interesting to see their facial expressions and like the parts of them. It's always usually like a therapy thinker analyzer part that's
Yeah.
like, "But okay." So so cuz yeah, I think we've been conditioned to in the psychology world to be that therapist that like you just described is
Yeah.
like giving the client these grand interpretations and here is your answer and here's the story of your life
Yeah.
and I think then there's also a lot of because of that that's portrayed in media and all around us in our culture we
Yeah.
then have clients coming in expecting that and then it can be this interesting offering to be like, well, what if we try it this way? And I think it's great.
Yeah.
I am a huge fan of parts work
Yeah.
and also weaving in these other ways of healing. And
Yeah.
I think it's powerful and empowering.
Very empowering. Yeah. I mean, we didn't even talk about that part, but it's huge. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The client's agency and yeah, helping them tap into what's already within this healing, this well of, healing
Mm-hmm.
energy within. Um, Somehow we're out of time, Natalie. I'm
I
so
know.
grateful I got to talk with you today, and I find this is how it goes on my show. I don't know about your show, but like 49 minutes into it, we're like hitting the good
Yeah.
stuff, and
Yeah.
it's like time to go because no one does a podcast over an hour for some reason, but maybe I will. So, with that being said, we'll have to do it again. And for
Yes.
folks wanting to learn more about you and your work and your podcast, can you just plug all that stuff and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah. Thanks, John. Yeah, this has been great. I feel like, yeah, we could talk for a couple more hours and keep diving into this stuff. But yeah, people can go to my website, which is ndwellnessservices.com. And from there, there's a contact button if you want to connect with me. You can also go to Instagram at Natalie Deering. And yeah, I'd love to connect with you all and see how we can work with each other potentially. And also my podcast, it's called That Wellness Podcast with Natalie Deering, IFS with a twist. It's a long title, but you can find that on Spotify, Apple, anywhere podcasts are. And you can also connect to that through my website as well. So yeah,
Great.
definitely reach out and check out the podcast.
Yeah, I love it. We'll put links to all that in the description. And yeah, thank you again, Natalie, for doing this.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Going Inside. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and share your favorite episode with a friend. You can follow me on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at John Clark Therapy, and apply to work with me one-on-one at johnclarktherapy.com. See you next time.